What if I told you that prominent writer and commentator Jamil Jaffer wants to see WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange extradited to the US to face prosecution for leaking classified information? But also that prominent writer and commentator Jamil Jaffer supports Assange's right to publish and calls his prosecution a dangerous attack on the First Amendment? And then what if I told you that there were actually two different prominent commentators named Jamil Jaffer who were complete opposites in their opinions and worldview? Sounds too wild to be true, but shockingly, it's not a fever dream I had after too much steak or too many episodes of Succession. It's the reality for these two guys. Jamil N. Jaffer from George Mason on the right and Jamil Jaffer from Colombia on the left. As the latter Jamil noted on Twitter, confusingly, there's a guy called Jamil N. Jaffer who's my ideological doppelganger. When I was litigating national security cases at the ACLU, he was working for the Bush administration. He's a nice guy, but we're on opposite sides of basically everything. He went on to describe how far the confusion sometimes went. Quote, someone told me that senior people in the Bush administration were initially apoplectic when they saw that Jamil had been hired. They thought the Justice Department had hired a lawyer who'd argue that some of them should be prosecuted for war crimes. Most recently, the two Jaffers tussled on Twitter over the banning of TikTok, with the Bush administration's Jamil Jaffer arguing that America needs to wake up to the threat of the Chinese Communist Party. There are legit national security concerns that have not been addressed by TikTok. The government has offered TikTok a way out, namely divestment. I'm highly skeptical, but it's out there. And the idea that banning a Chinese social media platform would set a dangerous precedent is a drastic overstatement. Meanwhile, the other Jamil, with two E's, argues that banning the platform would be a breach of Americans' First Amendment rights. Quote, it's conceivable that the US government will eventually be able to establish the necessity of a ban on TikTok, even if it hasn't done so yet. But the First Amendment would require the government to carry a heavy burden of justification. This is an important feature of our system and not a bug. Look. Look. We spend a lot of time in this country arguing about left versus right and Democrat versus Republican. But one of the real, very real dividing lines amongst Americans right now is on civil liberties in a cyber age, on the limits of free speech, on privacy online, and on government, dare I say, deep state intrusion into our lives online. So earlier I sat down for an actual debate on these issues with the two Jamil Jaffers. Those would be Jamil N. Jaffer, the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute at George Mason University, who also served in the George W. Bush Justice Department and White House, and Jamil Jaffer, the executive director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University and former director of the ACLU Center for Democracy. Two eminently qualified and, yes, fortuitously named guests. Thank you both for joining me on the show today. Before we get going, I have to ask both of you, Jamil and Jamil, you have the same names. You're both lawyers in the cybersecurity space. How often are you confused with each other? How well do you know each other? Have you debated before? Jamil from Knight Foundation, go first.
I think this is our first time debating, but we are often confused for one another. I get Jamil's fan mail all the time. I once got a check for him, in fact, which I sent back rather than trying to cash.
And Jamil from George Mason.
Well, listen, I appreciate the other Jamil sending back the check. I wish he had sent it to me so I could have gotten the money back. But look, I think we get confused every once in a while. I think if you hear us, though, in person, you could tell the difference. I will say, though, my mother did once call me and say she heard me on NPR, and I was like, Mom, I don't think that was me.
So, separate to your different voices, you have different views. Let's get into that today. Jamil from George Mason, let's start with you. Montana has a ban on TikTok starting next year. House Republicans have a bill to do the same thing nationally, and even the Biden administration and a fair number of Democrats are also mulling a ban if TikTok isn't sold to a U.S. company. Isn't this all rather over the top, banning a social media app used by millions and millions of Americans?
Well, I don't think so, Mehdi. I think the reason why we're talking about a TikTok ban at all is because we know that the Chinese government has access to the information that TikTok collects on its users, including these millions and millions of Americans that use it. And we know that that kind of access can give them the ability to combine that data with information they've already stolen from the United States, including our security clearance databases, from our credit card providers, from hotels, and use that to train AI algorithms to understand the American population and our American national security services that much better.
And Jamil from the Knight Foundation, Al Jazeera recently pointed out that the same congressional lawmakers who may ban TikTok are also likely to renew the FISA Act, under which the U.S. government forces internet giants like Google, Meta, Apple to share data on non-U.S. citizens overseas. So is there a bright line here in your view? Is it hypocritical to ban TikTok but not, say, Twitter or Facebook for doing what TikTok does but just being U.S.-based?
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's hypocritical. I think it's bad policy. I think the issue is, you know, banning speech platforms, banning communications platforms is something that we ordinarily associate with authoritarian regimes. It's not an accident that the governments that are most identified with this practice include those of Saudi Arabia and Iran and China. And I think we should be very careful about giving our own government the power to shut down Americans' access to speech from abroad. That doesn't mean that there's a categorical rule. I'm not saying that there are no circumstances in which the government couldn't or shouldn't shut down Americans' access to a foreign technology platform, but I think we should demand pretty good reasons for it. And here, I don't think the reasons the government has offered are very good, because there are ways of addressing these problems that would address or at least mitigate the concerns that the government has raised about privacy and disinformation, ways that wouldn't necessitate
such as
shutting down access to the platform altogether.
Such as, Jamil from the Knight Foundation, which ways?
Well, for example, just privacy regulation that would restrict what social media platforms could collect. I mean, I do find it a little bit, I find it notable that many of the people who are suddenly so interested in protecting Americans' privacy have not been at the table when we were discussing comprehensive privacy reform. You know, if you're so concerned about protecting Americans' privacy, then pass comprehensive privacy reform that would restrict not only what TikTok can collect, but also what Facebook and Twitter and YouTube can collect. I want to be clear, Mehdi, I'm not suggesting, I actually agree that there are real privacy concerns here. I agree there are real concerns about disinformation. I'm not here to defend China or defend TikTok. The question is, how do we address these problems? Yes. Is the right way of addressing them banning Americans from accessing the platform, or are there other measures that make more sense?
So let me put that to Jamil from George Mason. Why not take a consistent privacy position, as Jamil from the Knight Foundation puts it, have all social media companies stop doing what they're doing with our data, rather than just, you know, using this TikTok platform issue as a way to bash China?
Well, Mehdi, I think there's a fundamental difference between a Chinese company collecting data and sharing it with the Chinese government than an American company collecting that data, right? And Americans might reasonably say... A lot of Americans
might disagree with you.
No,
they might say we don't want any governments collecting our data.
That's right, they might, and we can absolutely have that debate, and we're having that debate in Congress right now. But one thing we can all agree on is we don't want a Chinese company that is subject to Chinese government regulation collecting this massive amount of data, sharing with the Chinese government, and being used for foreign intelligence purposes. We can debate, do I want to give my data to Facebook or Google or whatever? Do we want to regulate that? How should we regulate that? That's a great debate to have, but it's a fundamentally different debate than we're talking about a company that is owned and operated by the Chinese government and can be regulated by the Chinese government and have the data taken away. There is no real distinction, Mehdi, in China between the government and industry. We talk about that like it's an American company. It's just not true.
And the point that Jamil from the Knight Foundation made, that this banning a speech platform that millions of Americans access is the kind of thing we see dictatorships doing. It's not America should be doing that. What do you say to that?
I mean, let's talk about TikTok is not that kind of speech platform. Let's be serious about it, right? We're talking about dance videos and the like, but even beyond it, even if it was a speech platform, we're talking about one that is regulated by the Chinese Communist Party. There's no separation of powers in China. There's no judge, jury in China. It's the Chinese Communist Party deciding what they're surveilling and their proxy companies they're using. That's not the same thing as an American state, an elected governor, an elected state legislator deciding to ban something.
Before I bring Jamil from the Knight Foundation back in, I should push back and say the Mehdi Hasan Show is on TikTok. We have millions of likes and we don't do dance videos, just to be clear. Jamil from the Knight Foundation, respond to Jamil from George Mason's point about this is about the Chinese government and the Communist Party. It's distinct from any other platform and any other free speech debate.
Yeah, well, so two things. First, it is not true that TikTok is used only for dance videos. People use it, as you say, Mehdi, for many other things, including to bring to light human rights abuses in China. There's at this point, a number of videos by Uyghur activists that have gone viral on the TikTok platform. And you have to take that into account, too. Shutting down access to the platform means shutting down access for human rights advocates as well. But to go to the point that was made about China's collection of information being different. I mean, I agree to an extent, but the truth is that if China wants to collect information about Americans, it doesn't need TikTok in order to do that. You can buy very similar information from American data brokers quite freely. And that's because we don't have a comprehensive privacy law that restricts the collection of that data and the sale of that data. If you are really concerned about privacy, then your energy should be focused on that, not myopically on this single platform.
So let's broaden this debate out a bit, because this isn't just about kind of First Amendment and social media. We've also got this debate over the free press. We saw Joe Biden at the White House Correspondents' Dinner say journalism isn't a crime, and yet critics of the U.S. around the world, and a lot of people on the left and right in the U.S., Jamil from George Mason would say, what about Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks founder who's in British custody, fighting extradition to the U.S. for leaking, for publishing leaked diplomatic cables? His family says this week that the campaign to release Assange is on the cusp of success, thanks to part in support from the Australian government, but it's the U.S. government that's trying to extradite and prosecute him. 13 years since those original WikiLeaks cables released. A lot of people would say the United States government should not be following what dictators do and jailing someone for publishing information that embarrassed the United States government.
This is not Mehdi. This is not about Julian Assange and being a publisher. He is not a member of the free press. He is not the New York Times. He is not the Wall Street Journal. He's not the Guardian, right? Julian Assange is an activist who literally took data stolen from the U.S. government and intentionally published it, knowing what he had, knowing that it was illegal to do so, and did it without any qualms. And so this is not the free press. That is not Julian Assange. He does not have the motives of the free press. And it's one thing to talk about the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Economist, the Guardian. That is not Julian Assange. Let's be real.
Jamil from the Knight Foundation, do you want to respond to that Assange is not a publisher, is not part of the free press?
Yeah. You know who else takes information that is intentionally stolen from the U.S. government and publishes it for everybody to see? The New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, NBC. The publication of classified information is what allows the American public to be informed about government policy. And this has been true, for a century, maybe longer. The Pentagon Papers were stolen from the U.S. government, right? All of the information that we learned about torture at Abu Ghraib, at CIA black sites, about the drone strike program, about NSA warrantless wiretapping. All of this, like if my friend's rule had prevailed, then none of this information would have got to the public. I think that's a real problem. And I think that you can't draw a distinct, the problem is, you may be able to draw a kind of common sense distinction, I don't know, between Julian Assange and a reporter for the New York Times. But the indictment doesn't draw any distinction. The indictment charges Julian Assange with violations of the Espionage Act for having published classified information, period. And if you can charge Julian Assange with that, you can charge any national security journalist with that. That's the problem.
Which is why a lot of publications, including the New York Times and the Guardian, have come out in defense of Julian Assange. Let me ask you this, Jamil, from George Mason. One of the strange things in the national discussion about big tech and national security has been the emergence of a kind of left-right alliance of sorts against the U.S. government and the quote-unquote deep state. You're a rarity these days. You're a kind of more traditional national security conservative. A lot of your fellow conservatives, led by Donald Trump, MTG, Matt Gaetz, and others, have gone after the FBI, the CIA, surveillance state. They don't trust the Biden administration to regulate tech. They want to defund the FBI. Did you ever think that would happen on the right?
I did not. It's been a shocking change, and it's part of this larger populist movement that you've seen perk up in conservative circles. It's not traditional conservatism. It's not traditional national security conservatism on the left or the right. There's long been a consensus around the ability of the U.S. government and the need for the U.S. government to engage in national security efforts to protect our nation That's been common cause for many, many years. You saw Dutch Ruppersberger and Mike Rogers in the House Intelligence Committee. You saw Dianne Feinstein and her colleagues in the conservative circles come together, pass legislation like Section 702 and other authorities. This new emergence of a left-right alliance on the other end of the Mobius strip is definitely a major change that we've seen in recent years.
I mean, one of the reasons that alliance has probably emerged is because of the failure of people on your side of the argument, the memory of the Bush administration that you were part of. Sadly, we're out of time. That's a discussion for another day. But I want to give the last word to Jamil from the Knight Foundation. You may have seen that we had Matt Taibbi on this show, who still considers himself a liberal. Others disagree, to explain his kind of criticisms of big tech and Twitter and government surveillance, etc., at least when it's not Elon Musk doing it. But we do have a lot of people on the left who seem to have joined arms with Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz on this issue of privacy and surveillance and free speech, at least on the surface. Is that wise? Do you think these are good faith allies in the fight to save free speech?
Well, I mean, I think that the free speech landscape is extremely confused right now. I don't agree with Matt Taibbi's analysis of what took place at Twitter before Musk came on board. You know, for the most part, I don't think his conclusions are justified. But I will say that I think that the concern that some people on the right and some people on the left have about the power that social media platforms have in influencing and shaping and distorting public discourse, I'm very sympathetic to that concern. I think that's a totally legitimate concern. And figuring out how to address or counter the power that a small number of corporations have over the public sphere, that's a problem that people on the left and the right should be worried about and should be trying to think up solutions to.
No, I agree with you. I'm sympathetic to those arguments as well. I just happen to think that a lot of these populist right-wingers who say they're worried about surveillance and the power of big tech, they're just worried about it because they see themselves as the victims of it. They have no problem deploying it against others. My thanks again to Jamil Jaffer from the National Security Institute at George Mason University and to Jamil Jaffer from the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University.